Welcome back to Command Brief. I am your host, and today we are covering a story that every serious observer of global geopolitics needs to understand right now. Because in the last 48 hours, something significant has shifted. A man who spent years as the personal interpreter for one of China's most powerful leaders has gone on record with a warning that cuts straight to the heart of what is happening between Washington, Tehran, and Beijing. His name is Victor Gao. He is a former Chinese diplomat, a prolific international commentator, and the vice president of the Center for China and Globalization. And what he said recently was not the carefully measured language of a diplomat trying to avoid controversy. It was a direct, unambiguous signal that China has made up its mind about the conflict in Iran, and that the United States should be paying very close attention. Stay with me through this entire video, because by the end, you will understand not just what Gao said, but why it matters, what it tells us about the real state of the China-US relationship, and what could happen next if the current trajectory is not reversed. This is the full picture. Let us get into it. Before we get into what Victor Gao actually said, we need to understand who he is and why his words carry weight. Because in the world of geopolitics, not every commentator is created equal. Some people talk loudly and say very little. Victor Gao is not one of those people. Gao served as a personal interpreter for Deng Xiaoping, one of the most consequential Chinese leaders of the 20th century, the man who was personally responsible for transforming China from a largely isolated communist state into the economic powerhouse it is today. Being the interpreter for someone like Deng Xiaoping is not simply a language job. It means you are in the room when the most sensitive decisions are being made. It means you understand the thinking, the strategy, and the priorities of China's leadership at the deepest level. That kind of access leaves a permanent imprint. Today, Gao serves as vice president of the Center for China and Globalization, a prominent Beijing-based think tank that operates at the intersection of Chinese policy and international relations. He appears regularly on major international media platforms including Al Arabiya, CNN, and the BBC. He is one of the few Chinese voices who speaks in English with clarity, directness, and confidence, and that is precisely why his statements carry so much significance. When Victor Gao says something publicly, it is not an accident. In the world of Chinese public diplomacy, analysts of his stature do not simply go off script. His words are measured, informed, and intentional. With that context in place, let us talk about what he actually said. Speaking on Al Arabiya English, Victor Gao delivered a statement that immediately began circulating across international media. He was responding to the ongoing conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran, a conflict that began escalating dramatically in the early months of 2026 and has now reached a level of intensity that is affecting global energy markets, international shipping lanes, and the broader balance of power in the Middle East. Gao was direct and unambiguous. He stated clearly that China deplores Israel's military attack on Iran's nuclear facilities and considers it, in his own words, a very serious offense against world peace and security. He compared Israel's opening strikes against Iran to the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor during the Second World War, a comparison that is extraordinary in its weight. Think about what that analogy is actually saying. He is calling the strikes an act of unprovoked aggression by a militarily stronger party against a sovereign nation. He is placing moral responsibility firmly on Israel and, by extension, on the United States. He went further. He rejected Israel's stated justification for the strikes, which was that Iran was attempting to develop nuclear weapons. Gao pointed out what he called a blatant double standard, noting that Israel itself possesses nuclear weapons and has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In his words, and I want to be careful here not to reproduce his exact phrasing, he essentially argued that a nation which holds nuclear weapons in secret has no credibility lecturing another nation about its nuclear ambitions. Then came the statement that made the most headlines. When asked about remarks made by President Donald Trump that appeared to suggest knowledge of the location of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, remarks widely interpreted as implying a possible assassination, Gao was unequivocal. He stated that assassination of heads of state or government is not the right thing to do in the world of today. He warned that such an action could serve as a boomerang, his word, with unpredictable and deeply dangerous consequences for American interests around the world. Gao also addressed the question of whether China's position on the conflict was driven primarily by its economic dependence on Iranian oil. He pushed back firmly against this framing. He argued that China's position is rooted in its principled commitment to international law, sovereignty, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, not simply in protecting its oil supply. And on the question of what Iran is doing, he was remarkably direct. He stated that whatever Iran is doing is justified, because Iran is defending its own sovereignty and territorial integrity against aggression. That is a significant statement. It is essentially China's most prominent English-language public voice, aligning China's moral position with Iran's right to self-defense. Now let us zoom out and place Gao's statements inside the broader context of what is actually unfolding in real time, because the situation on the ground is evolving extremely rapidly. Starting in late February of 2026, Israel and the United States launched a series of military strikes against Iran, targeting its nuclear facilities and military infrastructure. The stated objective was to eliminate Iran's nuclear program and degrade its military capabilities. The strikes were significant. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the early stages of the conflict. Iran appointed his son as successor and responded with a series of counterstrikes against Israel, American military bases in the region, and various targets across the broader Middle East. One of Iran's most consequential responses was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This single decision sent shockwaves through the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet. Approximately 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas supplies pass through it every single day. When Iran shut that door, the effects were immediate and severe. Brent crude oil prices surged to around $106 per barrel, roughly 60% above pre-war levels. Gold crossed $4,697 an ounce. The International Energy Agency called the disruption the worst energy crisis in history and executed its largest ever coordinated reserve release, releasing 400 million barrels from member nations' stockpiles. J.P. Morgan projected that Brent crude could reach $150 per barrel if the strait remained closed into the middle of May. The United States responded to Iran's closure of the strait with its own naval blockade. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced from the Pentagon that the blockade was growing and, in his words, going global. He stated that no one sails from the Strait of Hormuz to anywhere in the world without the permission of the United States Navy. As of the time of this recording, 34 ships had been turned back and the U.S. Navy had seized Iranian vessels in the Indian Ocean. But here is where the situation becomes directly relevant to China and to Victor Gao's warnings. The U.S. blockade is not just aimed at Iran. It is aimed squarely at China. China purchases between 80 and 91% of Iran's total crude oil exports. In 2025 alone, that represented approximately 1.38 million barrels per day. Iran's oil revenue from China accounts for roughly 45% of Iran's entire government budget. The relationship between Beijing and Tehran is not casual, it is structural. It is essential to both economies. The United States knows this, and it has been escalating accordingly. The U.S. Navy seized a tanker carrying approximately 2 million barrels of Iranian crude that was bound for Chinese refineries. The Treasury Department imposed secondary sanctions on Hengli Petrochemical, a major Chinese refinery at the port of Dalian, accusing it of buying Iranian oil. And just days ago, the U.S. expanded its sanctions to target more Chinese shipping companies and tankers involved in transporting Iranian oil. The message from Washington is unmistakable. If you buy Iranian oil, you will pay a price. China's response has been careful but firm. Beijing has protested at the diplomatic level. Chinese officials have hardened their rhetoric. Xi Jinping himself, in what was described as a first for the Chinese president, called publicly for the Strait of Hormuz to be reopened, but China has not yet made any direct military moves. It is, for now, choosing measured pressure over open confrontation. This brings us to perhaps the most important part of today's analysis, because understanding what China is doing requires us to look past the headlines and examine the underlying strategic logic of Beijing's position. China finds itself in an extremely complex position. On one side, it has deep economic ties to Iran that it has no desire to sacrifice. Iran's oil is cheap, with Chinese buyers paying around $60 per barrel after the standard discount, far below market rate. That relationship represents real financial value for China's economy, and China enables Iran's access to a range of goods and technologies that Iran cannot obtain elsewhere because of Western sanctions. The two countries signed a 25-year cooperation agreement in 2021 that covers energy, infrastructure, and military cooperation. This is not a casual partnership. On the other side, China views its relationship with the United States as its most important bilateral relationship in the world. A Trump-Xi summit is expected in the coming weeks. Beijing has been carefully cultivating a fragile period of détente with Washington, and the last thing it wants is for the Iran situation to blow up that détente before meaningful negotiations even begin. So China is threading a very difficult needle. It is supporting Iran diplomatically and rhetorically. It is continuing to purchase Iranian oil through its shadow fleet of tankers that use false flags, spoofed transponders, and ship-to-ship transfers to obscure the origin of the crude. China's customs records officially show zero imports from Iran, yet its recorded imports of crude from Malaysia in 2025 reached 1.3 million barrels per day, more than double Malaysia's entire actual oil production. The math speaks for itself. The evasion network is sophisticated and has been running for years. But China also holds approximately 1.3 billion barrels in strategic petroleum reserves, enough for roughly 120 days at current consumption levels. It has been aggressively expanding its stockpiling capacity and has diversified its supply chains precisely to avoid being held hostage by any single source. Analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations have noted that as long as the conflict does not extend beyond a year, China has sufficient reserves to manage its domestic energy needs without Iranian crude. What this means is that Beijing has the ability to absorb the immediate economic shock. What it cannot absorb as easily is the political and strategic damage of being seen to back down completely under American pressure. China's entire international positioning over the past decade has been built on the premise that it is a rising power that stands firm in defense of its principles and its interests. If it folds completely in response to U.S. sanctions and naval pressure over Iran, that signals weakness, not just to Tehran, but to every other country in the world that is watching to see whether China is a reliable partner when things get difficult. This is why the statements of someone like Victor Gao matter so much. They are not simply personal opinions. They are part of China's public diplomatic signal, a message to Washington, to Tehran, to the international community, that China has taken a position on this conflict, that the position is principled, and that it is not going to be easily moved. There is one more dimension of this situation that deserves serious attention, and it is one that most mainstream coverage has largely overlooked. It involves the Chinese yuan. As the conflict has unfolded, Iran and China have been moving quietly but deliberately to use the Strait of Hormuz situation as a vehicle for challenging the dominance of the US dollar in global oil markets. Here is what is happening. Commercial vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz under Iran's de facto control are being charged transit fees, and those fees are being collected in Chinese yuan, not in US dollars. China's Ministry of Commerce acknowledged this arrangement in a social media post that confirmed the use of yuan for transit payments. Iran's embassy in Zimbabwe went further, posting publicly about the emergence of what it called the petro-yuan in the global oil market. At least 2 vessels had made transit payments in yuan as of late March. Now, to be clear, this is not going to de-dollarize the global economy overnight. Economists have noted that true de-dollarization would require the participation of the Gulf states, all of which have priced their oil in dollars since the 1970s. That is not happening anytime soon. But what this arrangement does do is add incremental pressure, normalize alternatives to dollar-denominated energy trade, and deepen the economic integration between China and Iran in a way that is directly designed to insulate both countries from the reach of American financial power. Kenneth Rogoff, a professor at Harvard and former chief economist at the IMF, described Iran's motive clearly. At one level, he said, Iran is poking its thumb in America's eye. At another level, Iran is completely serious about cultivating the yuan as an alternative because it allows both countries to sidestep the dollar-dominated financial system that gives the United States its extraordinary power to inflict economic pain through sanctions. This is about far more than the current conflict. It is about the architecture of global power, and it is a dimension of the Iran-China relationship that the Trump administration has clearly recognized, which is why the U.S. sanctions targeting Chinese refineries and shipping companies are escalating with such speed and intensity. So where does all of this lead? Let us be honest about the uncertainty here. This situation is moving quickly, and there are multiple possible trajectories. The most optimistic scenario is that the ongoing peace talks between the United States and Iran, currently being mediated by Pakistan, produce a genuine agreement before the ceasefire expires. The key issues on the table include freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, reconstruction, sanctions relief, and a long-term peace framework. If those talks succeed, the immediate crisis recedes, oil markets stabilize, and both Washington and Beijing have the space to move forward with their planned summit without the Iran conflict poisoning the atmosphere. But there are serious obstacles. The Trump administration has stated that only Iran's unconditional surrender is acceptable. Iran's new leadership, under the Supreme Leader's son, has every incentive to hold firm, both to demonstrate strength domestically and to avoid the perception that the strikes achieved their full objective. And any agreement that satisfies Washington may not satisfy Israel, which has its own set of demands around Iran's missile arsenal and regional proxy networks that go beyond what the U.S. is asking for. The most dangerous scenario is one in which the ceasefire breaks down, strikes resume, and the U.S. and Iran find themselves in a full escalation cycle, with China increasingly forced to choose between its economic interests in Iran and its strategic interest in maintaining stable relations with Washington. If a U.S. naval vessel were to directly intercept a Chinese-flagged ship, analysts have warned that China would be compelled to respond in a way that could rapidly transform a regional conflict into a confrontation between two of the world's major powers. A senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies described the U.S. as now facing difficult choices about how far to push its pressure on China. Interdicting Chinese-flagged vessels, she noted, would risk escalation with a peer competitor. Even the threat of such actions carries significant implications for global trade and alliance relationships. The Jerusalem Post recently noted that the U.S. blockade does not need to stop every barrel of Iranian oil. It needs to make the cost of continuing the trade higher than the cost of stopping it. And it needs to present Beijing with a menu in which every option serves American interests. That is the strategic logic. But logic and outcome are not always the same thing in geopolitics, and the margin for miscalculation in a situation involving naval assets, energy markets, nuclear programs, and great power competition is dangerously thin. Let us bring this all together. Victor Gao's statements are significant not because they are shocking, but because they are clear. They tell us that China has made a principled decision to align itself rhetorically and diplomatically with Iran's position in this conflict. They tell us that Beijing views the U.S.-Israel strikes as aggression, not legitimate self-defense. They tell us that China is willing to say so publicly, at the highest levels of its public intellectual and diplomatic apparatus, even as it carefully avoids any direct military escalation. What Gao's statements do not tell us is that China is ready to go to war over Iran. That is a line Beijing has not crossed and is unlikely to cross in the near term for reasons we have analyzed today. China's strategic calculus prioritizes the U.S. relationship, its own internal economic stability, and the long game of accumulating power and influence, not a direct military confrontation with the United States that it is not yet prepared to win. But here is the key insight for everyone watching this channel. The situation we are living through right now is not simply about Iran's nuclear program, or even about the Strait of Hormuz. It is a stress test for the entire post-Cold War international order. It is a test of whether the United States can continue to use its military and financial power to impose its will on the global system without triggering a coordinated challenge from the countries that have been most squeezed by that power. China and Iran, for all their differences, share a common grievance on that front, and the yuan-denominated transit fees in the Strait of Hormuz are a small but highly symbolic sign of what a world that has started to organize itself around alternatives to American dominance might actually look like. Victor Gao said something in one of his recent interviews that deserves to be heard clearly. He said that if the United States really gets bogged down in this war against Iran, no one knows what will happen in the coming years or decades. That is not a threat. That is a warning from someone who understands great power dynamics at a level that most commentators do not. and it is a warning that deserves to be taken seriously. That is the full command brief for today. We covered who Victor Gao is and why his voice matters. We walked through exactly what he said about Iran, China, and the United States. We analyzed the real situation on the ground, the U.S. blockade, the Chinese shadow fleet, the yuan-denominated oil payments, and the fragile ceasefire talks. And we gave you an honest assessment of where this could go next. If you found this analysis valuable, the best thing you can do right now is hit the like button and subscribe to Command Brief. We do not do hype here. We do not do clickbait without substance. We do research, we do analysis, and we give you the full picture every single time. New videos go up regularly, and if you want to stay ahead of the biggest stories in global geopolitics, this is the channel to be on. I will see you in the next one. Stay informed, stay sharp. This is Command Brief.